G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, just preparing for the Mindfield.
Hello there once again, folks. You are on the Mindfield. Wonderful to have you with us. We try to negotiate the ethical and moral dilemmas of modern life, such as they can be negotiated. I don't know, sometimes these things just seem to be more and more intractable, and what goes around just seems to come around again and again. And I fear that is the kind of territory that we are in today on this edition of the Mindfield. But maybe my co-host has a different view. Waleed Ali is my name. Scott Stevens is his.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm nothing if not politically optimistic, right, Waleed? So let me shock you with a bit of optimism here. Well, no, actually the opposite. I hate Melbourne Cup Day. I mean, I dread it. No joke. Every time it comes around, this bacchanalian festival of cruelty and banality and bad taste, this orgy of opulence. I mean, every year it strikes me as inappropriate, but this year kind of took the cake for me. It's never, it seemed to me, been more offensive to have this festival going on at the same time as Australia's brutal, and I think brutally bipartisan commitment to deterrence at all costs reaches a kind of hellish pinnacle on Manus Island, where 600 asylum seekers have effectively been abandoned now by Australia, left without food, water, and power in a now defunct immigration detention center.
Yeah, and I know that the event itself is interesting, the way that this has triggered a lot of protests, as we've seen, and that's not a new thing. What is new is that the Melbourne Cup seemed to get caught up in the middle of it. And you saw protesters trying to climb a crane, they were walking on train tracks, they were trying effectively to seize the attention of the nation on the day that the race stops it. And I'm not sure that necessarily had the effect that they were after. But the thing about this is that there's a politics that surrounds this, isn't there, Scott? And it basically is a politics of axiomatic hardness, I suppose we might call it. That you can't, that it's not even anymore about a pragmatic decision about whether or not any adjustment in policy would lead to an increase in votes. It's about the fact that this hardness has to be performed in such a way that it assumes that any softening would be somehow catastrophic and somehow immoral. But we've discussed on this program before about just how illiberal that kind of legal reason, not legal, that kind of moral and political reasoning is, because of course at the base of it is this idea that we must inflict pain and punishment on a certain group of people for the benefit of other people, which is the quintessential utilitarian position, and it's not remotely a liberal position, and yet we do flip to liberal arguments on occasion as well. We might get into that a bit later in the show. But Malcolm Turnbull was asked to talk about the position on Manus, what is unfolding there, and particularly his rejection of New Zealand's offer to take some people who are on Manus Island and Nauru. He was in recent talks with New Zealand's new Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, in Sydney, and this is what he said.
We know what the alternative looks like. Tens of thousands of unlawful arrivals and over 1,000 men, women and children drowning at sea. We have put the people smugglers out of business, and we will keep them out of business.
I think what's so interesting about that, and we've had Rob Mann, in fact, on the show talking about precisely this logic that has almost reached the level of a form of unquestioning political orthodoxy. I mean, that almost has the status of a liturgical response. I don't mean to be inappropriate in saying this, but when you raise the issue of asylum seekers and whether or not Australia will respond compassionately or even humanely or meet its international obligations, this is how the congregation out of Canberra responds.
And and it's unchallengeable, utterly unchallengeable,
absolutely,
and utterly convincing because of the repetition. It's a declaratory truth that it has.
Precisely right. Now look, this contrast, and I admit that it's a little bit of a cheap contrast between the race that stops the nation and a nation that effectively doesn't give a damn about the human cost of these deterrence measures. I know that that's a contrast that's easy to make. So, and I think one of the nice things about this show is we do try to steer away, I think, from cheap rhetoric or from sort of easy rhetorical or political stunts. So let me try to make another contrast, Waleed, and you can let me know if you think this contrast works. Instead of the race versus the catastrophe in Manus, How about another contrast between something that seems to be happening at our furthermost borders and something else that's happening at the heart of a nation? So here's my pitch to you. I don't know about you, and I actually don't know what you think about this, but I was stunned by the reason that the Prime Minister gave for his rejection of the key recommendations of the Referendum Council, most notably their recommendation that there be established a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice to the Parliament. What was so interesting? I mean, if the Prime Minister had simply said, this is politically undoable, a referendum would never get up. There's not enough. I mean, he could say the government doesn't have the capital. He could say that referenda themselves don't tend to work. He could have done any of those things, and I think while disputable, there's an argument that could be made about that. But that wasn't all that he said. He didn't just say that it was unachievable. He said it was undesirable.
And of course, we want to see more Indigenous Australians elected to the House and the Senate. But to have a national representative assembly, which is what we're talking about here, which would be in the Constitution and to which only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders could be elected, this is contrary to the principles of equality of citizenship in Australia.
That was the Prime Minister speaking at the same press conference where he was also appearing with New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Now, what's interesting there, Waleed, he just made the point that the political logic behind these harsh deterrence measures, they are quintessentially utilitarian and I think overtly illiberal. What the Prime Minister has just done here is evoked quintessentially liberal reasoning. So he's evoked, you'll notice, the cardinal political virtues of equality and citizenship, but evoked them as a way of denying a form of restorative justice, denying a way of registering the extent of the historical violence done to the First Nations of this land. And also, he seems to be unconcerned by the fact that one of the things that this Indigenous voice into Parliament would do is it would go some way to overcoming the historical decimation of the Indigenous population of Australia. So, you know, this reasoning, if you want more representation in Parliament, fine, get elected. I mean, there are certain historical realities on the ground that make that a really, really difficult proposition.
So, can I just interject here, though, Scott, and grind out just how anchored in liberalism it is, right? Because this is not an invention of Malcolm Turnbull. We saw this precise reasoning that John Howard used when the question of a treaty was being put to him, and indeed this reasoning will prevail now henceforth, I think, whenever the treaty is put. And John Howard said something I thought was really profoundly liberal and very interesting, where he said, you cannot have a nation cannot have a treaty amongst its own citizens. Right? But a treaty is something you have against opposing peoples, and so for a nation state to do it within makes no sense. Now, what's interesting about that, I think, is that it is an attempt, it's a form of determination, really, to see Indigenous people as nothing other than citizens, shorn of any of their cultural attachments, of any of their history, and indeed any of the history on the ground that entrenches those particular forms of identity and cultural attachment. Not that those cultural attachments require that trauma to exist, but that they are further entrenched by it. Right? You do get communities of political meaning on the basis of the experience of that trauma. And so it's one of liberalism's great blind spots, isn't it? That human beings can be more than just individuals and can be more than just citizens. And what I think is fascinating about the juxtaposition that we've identified here is that in this case, there is a determination really to view people as nothing other than citizens, only at the point when it deprives them of some kind of restitution. Right? At the moment where we are, where it suits us to view them as something other than individual human beings who have individual interests and individual concerns that we may or may not meet in a given circumstance. At that moment, we don't regard them as individuals. We regard them as sort of raw human matter that we can use for a grander purpose, but not when someone is asking for a form of recognition that is beyond the individual. I think it's extraordinary. Yes, I think it is amazing just how silently and quickly and deftly we can can switch from one stance to the other, and no one seems to notice.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the other things about that, and this has been one of the great critiques of liberalism, I should say, from the very beginning, I mean, going right back to the 18th century, is that liberal political orders don't do very well with either transcendental issues, and they don't do very well with history. The idea is that once you have everybody at a certain level, you can more or less keep the peace by conferring basic fundamental status on all members of a particular political community. But what liberalism cannot do is enact forms of restorative justice. In other words, otherwise noble concepts, I think, like equality, like citizenship, which I would insist are noble concepts. I think they are thick and not simply thin concepts. But in the face of what can only be described, I think, as a transcendental crime, an assault on the very soul of a people, an assault that is felt at every level, then these terms like equality and citizenship can't help but ring incredibly hollow. So here's the question. And look, I should just say, by the way, in the interest of historical interest, that it was your analysis, Waleed, of the impeccable liberalism of John Howard's logic in the refusal of the treaty. That was the first thing of yours that I read. Going back, dear Lord, sort of 7, 8 years ago now. And it was the reason that I made contact with you before we sort of had a gig or anything like this in the first place. I think your reasoning here is really, your analysis is really important. But what I'm wondering is, what happens when we bring Uluhru and Manus together? What happens when we bring these two twin crises together? Does it help us see something about the moral character of our common life? Does it have an effect on the way in which we can come to think about our national identity? By bringing them together, can we see something that we otherwise cannot see about ourselves? And can it promote anything more than simply guilt and hand-wringing?
I'm trying to figure out how to respond to this in a way I won't subsequently regret because it's too broad. Can I give you my initial impulse?
Please.
And I'll say, and it's nothing more than that. I probably have to rely on you and our forthcoming guest to help me reason through it, whether or not I'm prepared to hold this as a position long term. But I think it reflects that ultimately we believe in nothing.
Wow.
So the sort of casual ability to invoke different moral traditions, not even necessarily explicitly anymore, because that kind of reasoning is now a bit quaint, just generally. But the fact that we can so easily do it without even noticing, I think says that we don't have a particularly deep commitment to anything, really, to either of them. Now, there might be ways of reasoning through that. That is, we are liberal, but in the case of asylum seekers, we're dealing with non-citizens, and so the canons of liberalism simply don't extend to them, so on. I would say that restricting liberalism to the civic in that kind of a way demonstrates that you don't care much for liberal principles as an idea. You might think of them as a convenient way to arrange civic matters or something like that, but you don't really believe in the underlying ideas of them. But I wonder, and the thing that I fear, Scott, here, is that it reveals just how limited our resources are in constructing a sense of the nation. Wow. That we don't have the capacity to construct a sense of the nation that will reckon with other identities as prime and as primary as Indigenous identities in Australia. And Indigenous, not just identities. Identity is a thin concept in some ways. History and experience and trauma and all of those sorts of lived realities. We don't have a national identity that seems big enough to cope with that. And we don't have a national identity that impels us to come up with some kind of humane response to the claims of asylum seekers and refugees, non-citizens, who nonetheless have a claim under international arrangements to seek that citizenship. And I think the smallness of our national identity is perhaps exposed here.
Wow. Incredible.
There's
so many things to say about that.
It's a preliminary review. You've got plenty of opportunity to say something about it that'll problematize it if you like. But I look forward to that. I'm interested. Anyway, you are listening to The Mindfield. You can listen to us a bunch of ways on the radio machine. You can listen to us on the ABC Listen app, and also where you find your podcast. In fact, subscribe to the podcast, I think, is a great idea, because it helps our subscription numbers. No, sorry, because there are little extras that come along with the podcast, which you may or may not enjoy.
And in the back of my mind just then, Waleed, I'm thinking, one of the great things about this show is that we really don't script it. I really don't know what you're going to say on certain things. And then you come out with something stupid like that, and I think, we really need to script this show. Anyway.
It's just honesty. It's just honesty, Scott.
True. It boosts our podcast numbers. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Our guest. Wow, we're excited to have this guest. Suvendrini Pereira is John Curtin Distinguished Professor in Cultural Studies at Curtin University. And I should say, and Suvendrini, she joins us from...
Okay, back with the new movie immediately.